Hi, everyone. I'm Barb Chamberlain. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Active Transportation Division at Washington State Department of Transportation. Welcome to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit. Really excited to have you with us for a 4-day virtual event that's been full of learning, and we're thrilled to see folks from so many communities around the state and beyond. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. This summit is virtual, and those participating are joining us from many lands. Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes are two statewide organizations, and they acknowledge the land their offices in the Puget Sound sit on today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose lands you're on, look in the chat in a minute where you'll find a link to a map you can use to look up your place on the land. Without these communities and these people, we would not have access to this environment. We take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. We'd also like to note that we are recording this session and it will be available following the summit. The summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of a safe and healthy future where bicycles bring people together, eliminate inequity, and create thriving communities. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington State, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclists' rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 14 panels with expert speakers and free registration for all attendees. Thank you to the Washington State Department of Transportation, Columbia Bank, and Darrow. I'm now going to introduce the session panelists and our topic, and I'll hand it off to them to take over the slide and help us all have a great learning session. Our panelists today are Brian Wood with WSDOT, Kenneth Lowen also with WSDOT, and Michael Hintz with Tool Design. And in this topic, in this session, if you are walking, biking, or rolling, do the facilities available help you feel safe? Do they actually work for your mode of transportation? Are they inviting or convenient in terms of traveling from where you are to where you want to go? If the answer to one or more of these questions is no, what do we do to make things work? WSDOT is developing an evolved approach to level of traffic stress, which we abbreviate as LTS, and a route directness index, RDI. The goal is to develop an effective set of analytical tools to tell us both where and how we need to improve active transportation facilities for safety, connectivity, and access to destination. So we've done our introductions. We'll have the presentation. We'll have Q&A. You're encouraged to ask questions at any point during the presentation. Drop it into the chat. We'll be saving those and addressing those towards the end. And you'll also get a link for a Google feedback form at the end of the session. So again, ask your questions at any point during the presentation. I'm now going to stop my slide share and pass it to our panelists to introduce themselves and dive into the session.
Hello, I am Brian Wood. I am with WSDOT's Active Transportation Division. We're kind of the headquarters division, and then there are 6 WSDOT region active transportation coordinators, and we have another one of those with us today. So I'm serving as a statewide pedestrian and bicycle coordinator, and we're pleased to bring you this presentation on using level of traffic stress and route directness to improve active transportation network development. So please ask lots of questions, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end in the chat session. So before we get started, I'll have Kenneth and Michael introduce themselves.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Kenneth Lowen, and as you can see on the screen, I am the Active Transportation Coordinator for WSDOT's Northwest region. So that region covers basically the north end of Tacoma up to the Canadian border. And I would be participating in any active transportation work that WSDOT would be involved with, either as a state or often we work with local agencies. So if you are in that region and you have questions, especially on the WSDOT system, feel free to contact me and we'll have our contact information at the end. I'll pass it to Michael.
Great, thanks Kenneth. Hi everyone, Michael Hintz with Tool Design. I'm the Director of Planning in our Seattle office. And a lot of my focus is on active transportation network development, and I have a particular interest in safety. So really excited to talk about the work that WSDOT is doing to improve active transportation in the state, and some of the tools that we use when working with agencies to do the same. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to kick it off. So first thing to talk about is why are active transportation analysis tools needed? And I know I'm somewhat maybe preaching to the choir, so to speak, with the audience today. But really, it boils down to it's all about the network. And so what that means is, I think we all recognize that any individual's willingness to use a bicycle in particular as transportation is really related to their comfort in riding their bicycle on public routes. And so complete routes require complete networks, and we often don't have that. So we need some tool, some method of analyzing what that looks like. So just running through the bullets that you see on the screen. Well, I guess I should check with Michael and Brian. You're viewing my screen correctly? Okay, thank you. The first bullet, it's all about the network. First bullet, active transportation investments have not always considered network completion. And yeah, usually these active transportation investments historically have been built more or less in spot locations that are associated with specific projects. And so what that's left us with in a lot of locations, as you know, is we may have some locations that have very good bike facilities, but there are very frequently discontinuities in our overall network that don't necessarily appear until you look at some kind of analysis. So I'm showing on the slide here on the right-hand side, the image there. This is Colorado Springs, if you can see the text there. This is not even in Washington State, but you can imagine this applies in many jurisdictions, where what's shown here are Colorado Springs various bike networks, whether it's conventional bike lanes or trails or what have you. And at any given location, the facility might be fantastic, but when you start looking at the whole network, you see, wait a minute, this is not a network. It doesn't really connect to one another. So that's what that first bullet's getting at. Second bullet, sidewalk networks, which we all recognize are very incomplete, particularly in some communities. Even so, they're still often more developed than bicycle networks, and that's just given the nature of how sidewalks and bicycle networks, facilities, that really should say facilities, how those facilities were developed over the years. Third bullet, a network perspective is needed to address barriers to active travel. And what this is getting at is it's really hard to think about barriers if you don't look at the whole network, and kind of building on a theme here, obviously. Last bullet, analysis tools and infrastructure selection guides are needed to develop complete networks that work for everyone. You don't improve what you don't measure. We all know that. So we need some way to analyze and measure the active transportation networks that we are building. Okay, another thing to think about is when you're thinking about what it means to have a complete network, is it's not good enough to just look at a map and see what lines connect to other lines. That approach will often kind of leave behind these network gaps. So if you imagine this location that's shown on the screen, and this is the same location, one shown from above and one shown from street view. If you think about the street that you're sitting on in this perspective, that street may be very comfortable, may be very safe for bicycling. It may be a residential neighborhood. You may even feel comfortable letting your children ride on that particular street. And if you look at that on a map, it may look like a continuous street of low stress facility. But when you get down to street level, obviously there's a major gap here that you would never let your child try to get across on their own. 7 lanes of uncontrolled traffic. So that's just another factor to think about. It's not just the mapping, but it's also the gaps that may result, at point gaps, I should say. Okay, so just real briefly, I want to talk about why we're thinking about level of traffic stress as an analysis tool, as opposed to other tools. And I'm sure, again, most of you, if not all of you, already are aware of what I'm about to say, but it's worth repeating. So we all know traditional traffic analysis is done in a way, in a method that's called level of service. And this analysis really focuses on traffic flow characteristics. So thinking about, it really analyzes traffic volumes, street capacities, the relationship of those two things. It's really a throughput-based analysis, as you can see here. So that type of analysis spits out levels A through F, level of service A through F, and level of service A represents free-flowing traffic, You may even say very low usage, which may or may not be positive, and in most cases may be a negative, all the way down to level of service F, in which that's basically gridlock. So this is sort of the traditional traffic analysis approach to thinking about a transportation network. Well, very clearly, trying to translate this type of analysis into an active transportation tool has some pretty significant problems, which I've listed a couple here. There's many others. If we had time to go over, I'm just going to briefly touch on these three. So first and foremost, it really does not address at all the multimodal interactions with traffic and even with other multimodal types of active transportation. So it also doesn't account for different levels of skill or comfort or cognitive abilities of the active transportation users. This is different than levels of service for traffic, in which you can essentially assume that you're working with a driver base that all is relatively in the same realm of skill level, which obviously is debatable, but everyone's passed their driver's test. Everyone understands the rules of the road, whether they apply them or not. This is different than active transportation, where you're really talking about everyone in the entire population who has the opportunity to walk on the sidewalk or ride their bike. And then lastly, and maybe even most importantly, a level of service approach. It doesn't say this outright, but the implicit assumption is that lower use levels are somehow better, and that's really kind of counter to active transportation networks. Okay, LTS, as I'm sure, again, most of you know, this was a concept that was introduced in 2012 by Peter Firth and others in this report that was published by Mineta Transportation Institute. And really it was intended to be a new way of analyzing bicycle facilities. And I do want to stop and note that it was originally intended to analyze bicycle facilities specifically, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. And so what it was really trying to analyze is the experience of the user and tying that to the quality of the facility that was being provided, as opposed to thinking about throughput only. So it's really more of a tolerance-based analysis and less of a throughput-based analysis like level of service. And the proposal was for these 4 levels of traffic stress. And so the level of traffic stress being the lowest level, and at this level, you would think this is a facility that would be usable by children up through, obviously, essentially everyone. Up through level of traffic stress 4, which would be a situation where only very few people would use it. And basically, again, realizing this was originally focused on bicycle facilities, this would be a high-speed, high-volume roadway with no bicycle facilities, where the only person that's going to ride their bike there is someone who's extremely confident. Okay, so what are the inputs for level of traffic stress? The inputs are, as you see here, number of travel lanes, speed of traffic, number of vehicles, the presence or absence of bike lanes, the width of those bike lanes, and the presence or absence of some type of barrier. These are the generic ones that were established by Peter Firth's work to inform what the LTS 1 through 4 might look like. And as you can see in the bottom image here, just trying to demonstrate that higher LTS makes active transportation modes much less desirable. So when you look at this street, which is up in Everett, if you look at it on the surface, or especially if you didn't have any pictures of it, you would say, oh, well, this is a street that's signed at 35 miles per hour, which you can see over in the right there. It's got a sidewalk on both sides, but it's 7 lanes wide. It's got very high traffic volumes, very high traffic speeds, no dedicated bicycle facilities. So even though you could say there are sidewalks on both sides of the street, and those sidewalks are relatively empty, which in the traditional level of service type of messaging would be a positive. Oh, there's plenty of excess capacity in the sidewalk. The reality is this is really a terrible place to walk. And that's what the level of traffic stress is trying to get at. Just expounding on that idea just a little bit. So the way WSDOT is applying level of traffic stress, we are applying the now traditional bicycle level of traffic stress, which you see in the upper left corner. So we're calling that BLTS 1 through 4. And then on top of that, we're overlaying a pedestrian level of traffic stress, which we're developing now. And so that's following the same convention. We're calling it PLTS 1 through 4, and you can kind of see what those 4 levels would represent. And then as with all the work that we're doing, overarching everything that we're doing, this all falls under the umbrella of the safe system approach, which Brian will get into a little bit. Actually, I think Michael will touch on that a little bit later. And then I do want to mention, if you haven't read it already, WSDOT's new, as of last year, active transportation plan did introduce this at the statewide level, the level of traffic stress as a means of evaluating roadways. So the intent for LTS analysis is to replace user count data to guide decisions that we make about transportation facilities. Traditionally, we've tended to look at user counts, so higher user count areas would get facility improvements. Obviously, that is not necessarily the best way to approach. So now we're looking at the entire network and looking at high LTS locations and how we can address those problems. LTS analysis, like I just said, is also being developed at the statewide level. So we're looking at the entire system. Brian's going to touch on that a little bit. And then the last bullet here, just wanted to mention that our performance metrics and ways of measuring success for our active transportation elements are all tied to the active transportation plan now as well. And so with that, I believe I'm passing it to Brian.
Thank you, Kenneth. So everybody hear me okay? Kenneth gave us a nice introduction to LTS, and a second analysis tool WSDOT looked at was route directness. Highways can act as barriers to active travelers, similar to rivers, and crossing locations represent points where the highways are permeable to travel. WSDOT published the multimodal permeability pilot that examined out-of-direction travel, developed route directness index data in GIS, and suggested ways to use RDI data to develop performance metrics. Like LTS, data limitations were a barrier, but GIS-based route directness has value when asking high-level questions. So RDI is a way of comparing the out-of-direction travel for different routes rather than just comparing the travel distances of those routes. An RDI of 1 means you can walk directly to your destination. An RDI of 2 means it's twice as far as a direct path, which takes twice the time, twice the physical energy, and twice the exposure to weather and other conditions. These illustrations show that barriers can be physical or functional. In the first illustration there, a physically high RDI is shown for traveler B. The second illustration shows a functionally high RDI situation. Neither traveler A or B has a low level of traffic stress crossing that would enable direct travel via the roadway network. The image shows such a crossing on State Route 99 that leads to a major bus stop. There's a median island which offers some protection for confident pedestrians, but this high-speed, high-volume roadway is not low LTS. Next slide. Most people who are familiar with LTS would say it is a GIS tool, and WSDOT has developed state highway LTS layers for GIS, but it's important to recognize that such layers only offer a high-level view of our highways. They are based on very limited data. Such data is valuable when the questions are broad, such as whether we see more crashes in places where the LTS or RDI values are higher. That kind of information, combined with other data layers, could help us distribute program funding in as equitable a manner as possible. But it won't tell you what to do where, and it won't capture many of the concerns that a walk down the street will reveal. Because of those limitations, WSDOT is trying to develop a manually applied method for capturing LTS and RDI information. Manual methods can see concerning factors such as high volume driveways and large curb radii. They can also see positive factors such as bulb outs and rapid flashing beacons that currently don't show up in GIS data. Next slide. A GIS layer titled Active Transportation Data Level of Traffic Stress is now available online through WSDOT's online map center to everybody who wants to go there. And the layer is based on the general level of traffic stress lookup table shown on this slide. The layer brings up a map of Washington State where all state highways are color-coded according to LTS. At first, everything appears to be the highest level. LTS 4, color-coded, is the color red. But zooming in on a population center, there are some places where the LTS is lower. One such location in Tacoma is shown on this slide, oriented north on the right. An LTS color key is also provided here. And in the screenshot, State Route 163 changes from LTS 4 to 3 to 2 and finally to 1 as it goes to the Point Defiance Ferry Terminal. Clicking on a location on the highway brings up data showing the posted speed, number of travel lanes, traffic volume, general LTS ranking, and then also the bicycle LTS ranking, which might be somewhat different. Next slide. Let's say we already know we have a crossing concern. Maybe we found it using high-level GIS data, or maybe it comes up in a corridor study. Using the concepts of LTS and RDI, we can begin to paint a picture of a location that is easy to discuss with decision makers or the public. Actual solutions may be highly location specific, but getting to an acceptable RDI or LTS level can be a matter of policy. Here, we see a location in Walla Walla, Plaza Way, and State Route 125. I've indicated a potential route from the homes in Rancho Villa to harvest smoothies. In the upper left, you can see the legal pedestrian route that was required until recently. The street level view shows how out of direction the travel task is, and also how high a level of traffic stress the location is. Imagine crossing this in a wheelchair. Looking at the local roads, it is still over 500 feet from the Plaza Way SR 125 intersection to the West Titan Street, where there's a legal crossing that would take you to harvest smoothies. Next slide. Fortunately, a new roundabout improvement now provides a network direct route from Rancho Villa to the smoothie shop. And the level of traffic stress will drop from our highest level to one where the safe system approach is observed. And the facilities are ones that most people would be willing to use. This doesn't address all of the RDI issues in this corridor, but if you can only have one crossing, it should definitely be a great one. And that safe system approach, as Kenneth said, is lowering those speeds in many cases. So if there is a mistake made, the person is going to walk away from it. Next slide. As noted earlier, we are in the early stages of developing a manual process for evaluating a location's LTS and RDI. Such a process can be scalable with different amounts of data looked at for a project, let's say, or a corridor study. You saw a lookup table used in our GIS analysis of LTS, and tables can be used in a manual process as well, and they can apply to more specific situations. Manual analysis can consider the effect of a Walmart driveway that sees high activity on a sidewalk path, or a gravel pit that covers bike lanes and loose rocks. Here we see a wonderful mid-block crossing connected to a trail and with a center protection island and rapid flashing beacon. That certainly impacts LTS and RDI. You might be surprised to find out that WSDOT does not have this mid-block data in a statewide GIS layer that can inform network analysis. You'd have to know it was already there. LTS and RDI determination and finding solutions that lower the high LTS and RDI values will often require professional judgment. Here, the safe system approach can help by asking, what happens if a crash occurs despite the improvements we thought were LTS, were low level of LTS, LTS 2? If the design lowers the speed of impact, it always helps. Next slide. One tool we have to give us a starting point for manually evaluating LTS is additional lookup tables. Our LTS lookup tables are based on work done by others, such as Mineta Institute in 2012 and Peter Firth in 2017. We also looked at our table values with a safe system approach lens. The tables shown here and the following slides are very similar to the ones that inform our GIS layers, but they refer to features we don't have GIS data for. Presumably, we will have that data in the future, and it will be a relatively easy task to build new GIS layers from these additional tables. Here, we see tables that consider the effect of sidewalk characteristics on level of traffic stress rankings. Using newly developed sidewalk presence data, we'll be able to use that bottom table on this slide to develop a pedestrian LTS layer for our online GIS map center. But the point here is that a manual evaluation lets us go further. The top table lets us evaluate roads where we know the sidewalk is 6 feet or greater in width. Where that is true, Many of our 35-mile-per-hour roadway segments that were high LTS can be reorganized or recognized as reaching our benchmark of pedestrian level of traffic stress 2. And then you could use them in reverse as well. So if you want level of traffic stress 2 on a 35-mile-an-hour road, make it 6 feet wide. Next slide. Here are two other pedestrian LTS tables that consider sidewalks with buffers and sidewalks with robust physical barriers, like Jersey barriers. With a Jersey barrier in place, one can have their high-speed highway and walk it too. Note that adding a Jersey barrier does not lower the LTS of a road. It mitigates the LTS. This is an important distinction. In some cases, mitigation is a good choice, such as putting a separated shared use path on SR 520 over Lake Washington. In other cases, there may be a strong case for changing the road to lower LTS, such as where it passes through locations with significant pedestrian demand, and there is a desire to make the environment more walkable. At a low LTS, sidewalks and bike lanes will usually still be important features, but they would require less fortification against traffic. Next slide. These tables allow us to account for standard and buffered bike lanes. And note the predominance of LTS 3 and 4 at speeds over 30 miles per hour. This reflects that safe system approach that accounts for the potential for serious injury and fatality if a crash should occur. And next slide. These tables show increasing protection from motor vehicle traffic. We recognize that a flexible delineator is not going to stop a vehicle from leaving a lane, but it is a much stronger signal to a driver to pay attention to the road, so we consider it to have an effect on LTS. Next slide. WSDOT is currently evaluating the best ways to develop a publicly available, high-level intersection LTS layer for our online map center. Most of the data that would help us are not available statewide, in statewide stewarded data layers though. So a manual method offers more flexibility. But there again, there's this interest in having tables that suggest solutions just as they do for linear facilities. This is problematic considering the complexity of intersections and the fact that many crossings will require a suite of interventions to qualify as a low level of traffic stress. Signalization could be considered to influence level of traffic stress in that it gives vulnerable users a turn, but we don't have evidence that intersections with signals are always aligned with the safe system approach. Ramps are especially challenging. This set of screenshots is a small subset of the ramp scenarios that exist in Washington State. Looking at the top left, the Seattle example includes a number of features that may increase vulnerable user exposure or introduce complex movements that raise LTS. The upper middle picture shows a location in Olympia that is legally usable for bicyclists and pedestrians, but there is significant exposure and no active transportation facilities. The bottom picture is from Walla Walla, where good sidewalks and bike lanes are interrupted at the ramp junction. The roundabout at top right does a good job of managing multiple modes with both facilities and reduced operating speeds that align with the safe system approach. Next slide. This slide outlines possible steps for manually evaluating a corridor in terms of LTS and RDI. I won't go into detail here, but the general idea is to assign LTS values to the various crossings and segments using our lookup tables or other information. Then we need to identify destinations and distances between them that are available, that use available routes and low LTS crossings. The image shows a segment of State Route 224 in West Richland. There are lots of reasons to cross the highway here. Clearly, young people are using the crossings, and a bicyclist on a sidewalk indicates bicycle LTS is high for the segment. Having some LTS and RDI values to refer to could help when thinking about improvements in this particular situation. Next slide. So to illustrate an analysis effort, I've sketched a hypothetical highway corridor, which is the fat gray line, with associated local roads. The local roads are assumed to be low LTS for this discussion. The highway crossings have all been assigned an LTS using lookup tables. Then representative origins, the pink houses, and destinations, orange triangles, were chosen. The red and yellow arrow lines show physically direct paths, but the LTS is either too high, red, or likely too high, yellow, for many active travelers. The green arrow line shows a low LTS path, but it is very indirect to reach the destination that's circled in blue. Next slide. This slide illustrates how we can think about solutions to RDI concerns. The red line shows a direct path from origin 3 to destination B, but The high LTS crossing eliminates it as a route choice for most people. The green line shows a low LTS path from origin 1 to destination A, but the path is very indirect. RDI issues can be addressed in several ways. Sidewalks or shared use paths can be added to the main corridor so users can reach an existing low LTS crossing. Crossing conditions can be improved where crossings are high LTS. New crossings can be developed at grade or in some cases over or under the highway. New connections such as trails can be added to develop low RDI access to low LTS crossings. Here we propose improving an LTS4 crossing to an LTS2 and or adding a trail connector that would expand the low LTS network and access an LTS2 crossing. Next slide. This slide shows that in some cases, developing a new crossing is the best solution for addressing poor route directness. Adding a mid-block crossing makes trips between A and B accessible for most people and reduces the likelihood that people will just create their own crossing location to avoid a safer but much more out of direction trip. And next slide. So what is missing? Well, the manual process discussed here is in the earliest stages of development, and we need to find funding to take it further. The lookup tables we talked about for sidewalks or bike lanes can be very helpful, but we lack something similar for intersections. We need easy to use solutions guidance that we can point designers to. And we've got the design manual, of course, but we also have many other great guidance tools that are out there, and they need to be culled and synthesized into a single Washington State guide that is relatively straightforward to use. And finally, we need to keep working toward a GIS solution that is informed by a comprehensive statewide active transportation data set that is fully stewarded. We should know at a click which intersections have pedestrian protection islands and where we have painted bike boxes. Michael will now take the helm and talk more about the pedestrian LTS and solutions available to us.
Great, thank you, Brian. Yeah, so I want to speak more to, as Brian mentioned, much of the data that would be used in a pedestrian level stress analysis just is not yet available at the statewide level. However, it is often available at the local level. So I wanted to speak to PLTS analysis that we typically do for some of the pedestrian planning work that we do, and some real on-the-ground examples of specific enhancements and countermeasures that can be used to improve people's access to places where they want to go. So this slide, I'll just kind of walk you through it. When we do pedestrian level stress analysis, we typically focus on street crossings for two reasons. Crossings tend to be the most notable barriers for people walking. As Brian and Kenneth pointed out, you can have a sidewalk network, but oftentimes when it comes to crossing the street, it can be a real challenge. And also it depends on a person's ability to get across the street. And it also happens to be where most of the crashes occur, is at crossings. And then I guess the second reason, as I pointed out, data is often lacking for analyses that would be used to measure segment level, pedestrian level of traffic stress. I would say this is changing a bit with newer tools and services that are being used to collect data at scale on things like sidewalk presence, sidewalk condition, presence of buffers, and things like that. But for now, it can be challenging to have that kind of data. And agencies typically don't have great data sources at the segment level. So on the screen here is a screenshot of a pedestrian level traffic stress analysis that we've conducted for a local jurisdiction here in Washington. And the vast majority of, I'll just say the vast majority of residential and local streets will score as a level of traffic stress 1. So we typically focus this analysis on arterials and collector roadways. So what you're seeing on the screen are 4 levels of stress. The green dots is stress level 1, which represents little to no traffic stress and requires little attention to the traffic situation. And these would be your 8 to 80 crossings. The blue dots are level of traffic stress 2, and they represent little little traffic stress, but requires more attention to the traffic situation than that of which a young child could have and be capable of. So this is, we look at, we consider children that kind of break point to be 10 years or younger when considering what they're capable of navigating to get across the street. For the yellow dots are level traffic stress 3, and this is moderate stress, suitable for adults, but most adults would feel fairly uncomfortable using this type of crossing. And then finally, the level 4 represents high traffic stress that really only an able-bodied adult with limited route choices would attempt to use. So the inputs that we use for this analysis are vehicle volumes, presence of traffic signals, other stop control, like stop signs, number of lanes, the prevailing speed, or where that's not available, the posted speed limit, other crossing enhancements like refuge islands, crossing islands, RFBs, and the like. And then the output is a map like this, and for every marked and unmarked crosswalk. And then we also look at a threshold, the minimum distance between high comfort or higher comfort crossings, and we typically use 600 feet as that threshold. So where the distance between PLTS 1 or 2 crossings is greater than 600 feet, we would consider that a detour and a barrier. So those teal colored lines that you see on that image are where there's that threshold is exceeded. So those are places that we would focus in on to really focus efforts to identify additional high comfort crossings to build. And so it's a very useful analysis to help us really focus in on those situations and those locations where getting across the street could be greatly improved to provide people's access, improve people's access. And obviously these would be the high priority locations. So that's, yeah, really useful analysis that we often do with our pedestrian network planning efforts. Next slide, Kenneth. So once we've identified those segments where there's a need for a high comfort crossing, we look closer to understand what the land uses are, what the destinations are in those areas that people might want to get to, and hone in on specific locations where it makes sense to install a new crossing. And so yeah, if it's we look at where schools are, parks, other community destinations, and that might help inform where you're going to install a higher comfort crossing. In this case, 5-lane arterial, 35 miles per hour. There are a number of enhancements that could be put in place to lower the stress of the crossing and improve safety. On here is just a few, installing a crosswalk, but enhancing that with some kind of signal. Hybrid beacon would probably be appropriate on here, just given the speed and the volumes of the roadway and the configuration. But I will say that a question that we always start with, and I'll talk about this more in a bit, is, and I think Brian referred to this as well, as a safe system approach. So really looking at the entire corridor and asking questions. Can this roadway be rechannelized? Can lanes be reduced on this roadway, which would have the benefits of shortening the crossings for pedestrians, would have speed management benefits, and the safety benefits of that are proven. Lots of studies have been done on that. So we would start with that question. And so rechannelizing and perhaps reducing the posted speed within the corridor. If that can't be done, then we look to other solutions, some of which are listed here. But certainly rechannelizing would provide benefits and opportunities to install certain countermeasures like curb extensions that could also help to reduce the crossing distance and improve the level of comfort for the crossing. Next slide. So just, yeah, a bit more on the safe system approach. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term and the concept, but generally it recognizes that a vehicle size and a driver's operating speed coupled with the roadway design are factors that determine the most effective methods to reduce crash potential. So many safe system improvements focus on vulnerable road users, such as pedestrians and bicyclists. And the good news is that designing to reduce exposure to potentially fatal crashes for the most vulnerable road users is a proven and effective strategy to achieve better outcomes for all users, motorists and motorcyclists included. So this does represent a shift to focus on the most effective countermeasures to reduce crash exposure for everyone, which is an evolution from a system oriented primarily around modes or number of specific types of users in a given situation. So to address conditions for all vehicle types and reduce crash exposure for all road users, we might make more systematic improvements that provide drivers with the time in which to see and respond to the presence of others in the roadway. So focusing on these 5 or 6 principles: separation, separating vulnerable users, such as the separated bike facility you see in the upper left image, is certainly an effective strategy for reducing that exposure. And this can be done, physically. It can also be done with time at signals to give vulnerable users more time to cross the street, leading time to cross the street, etc., and protected phases. Speed control I already spoke to, but that's certainly a very effective method for reducing exposure and improving or lessening the severity of crashes. And then, just thinking through predictability and simplicity, just making it easier for everyone to use the roadway safely. People tend to make fewer mistakes when they know what to expect and when their decisions are simple. So that's a real key principle. And then this idea of forgiveness and restrictiveness. Forgiveness is really just that idea that a simple mistake does not result in a serious injury or fatality. And then the idea of restrictiveness is that the system prevents the user from making decisions that increase the likelihood of a death or serious injury. So again, those systemic changes like reducing speeds really hits on both of those. Speaking of speed reduction, I think there's always a question of how do we get speeds down? Even if we lower the speed limit, how do we get speeds down? And there are a lot of options available, both physical and non-physical. Physical things, vertical deflections and horizontal shifts in the roadway. Visually narrowing the roadway is another effective strategy. And at intersections, reducing the speed of turning movements by tightening the turning radii, installing things like curb bulbs. And non-physical measures such as just signage and markings that are intended to raise awareness and reduce speed through visual indications. Something I haven't seen a lot of in Washington, but a lot of other states are using them, are things like these lines in the roadway that indicate reduction in speed and just kind of raise people's awareness. It's that middle image there. To just provide those visual indications that there's a change in context and a change in condition. And then I guess last less commonly used is diversion treatments, just to reduce cut-through traffic by obstructing or otherwise preventing traffic movements. And those are, used more in high pedestrian activity areas where there are some alternative routes to take. And then I guess finally, it's just important to think of context always. And some measures are more appropriate in certain contexts than others. I'll just go through a couple examples here. If you go to the next slide, this is a state highway, Eastern Washington, and it is 35 mph posted speed, and this happens to be a school crossing. There are other pedestrian activity generators in the vicinity, and so the first thing you might try to do in this situation is lower the speed. And there are examples of state routes in this type of context where the speed's been reduced to 25 miles an hour. But obviously there's a need for both physical and non-physical measures to really physically enforce that speed. So some of those might be the speed reduction markings, speed feedback signs, putting in high visibility signal like an RFB, and then also physically or visually narrowing the roadway. So there could be an opportunity in a situation to potentially widen the roadway in a short segment and put in a refuge island in the middle, which can serve as both horizontal deflection and to kind of visually constrict the roadway as well. So gateway features like that can be quite effective. Next slide is another example. This is more of a Main Street example. And again, another community in Eastern Washington where in this case, the speed was lowered to 25 mph, but no real physical changes were made. And on either side of this downtown segment, there are bike lanes, but they were dropped in favor of maintaining or providing on-street parking. So this appears to be a natural candidate for a rechannelization, typical 4 to 3 lane conversion, which would allow you to do a lot of things to improve the LTS for pedestrians and bicyclists, and generally contribute to a more vibrant downtown. So yeah, if you were to do that, you could continue those bike lanes. You'd obviously be able to narrow the crossings, install curb extensions, possibly even install a landscape median, and then greatly improve the existing pedestrian crossings, which you can see in that smaller image. They're just unsigned, high visibility marked crossings. So you're asked to cross 4 lanes of traffic in that situation without any other enhancements. So a lot of opportunities in this situation. I think I have one last slide. I think Brian mentioned that WSDOT is feverishly working on and looking for resources to develop its own guidance around pedestrian level traffic stress and just to provide designers the strategies that are really geared towards the Washington context. So in the meantime, there are a lot of great resources out there that people should be referencing. I think worth a mention is the State Strategic Highway Plan, which provides a great framework for applying the safe system approach in Washington State. It's a good place to start to familiarize yourself with that approach. Of course, it's Googling safe system will return a lot of hits from FHWA on the safe system and the various strategies for that. And speaking of FHWA, just searching proven safety countermeasures, you'll come to a page where you'll find a summary of a growing list of safety countermeasures that are proven. And I think that count is now up to 28 countermeasures. And each one of these, they provide a summary of the countermeasures, where they're appropriate, and resources for more information on those, including the crash modification clearinghouse, which really is a clearinghouse for research-based studies on each of these countermeasures. The Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide from FHWA is also a great resource for that context, and strategies for network development in that context. And I know we're kind of at time here, so just a few more on there. The Bikeway Selection Guide from FHWA is also a great resource for how to reduce bicycle level of traffic stress and what the best strategies are. So I'll just stop there. Enough questions.
Thanks all. And we've got at least 4 questions from the chat. Maybe we can actually get through all 4. One is whether we, WSDOT, have developed guidelines with specific speed and volume thresholds to say this facility type at this location, or is the guidance still broader than that? And I'm going to say it's still broader than that. Brian, if you want to add.
Yeah. So it's a starting point. So I showed you those lookup tables in terms of LTS, and we have a general guidance directive or whatever under complete streets that suggests we should be attempting to get to level of traffic stress 2. And there can be various ways that you do that. You might do it by lowering, changing the number of lanes, changing the posted speed, and then maybe putting sidewalks and standard bike lanes there. You might be mitigating it by putting a robust barrier or something there that allows the bikes to operate while the traffic is still otherwise a high level of traffic stress situation. So I would say it was a little easier to do that with linear facilities than it is with intersections. Once you get to the crossing, you still got to get across that multi-lane high-speed road, and we're working on that piece feverishly. But I also want to get everybody to understand that it isn't just as simple as, okay, you built the bike lane, and so everything's fine now. You come to that Walmart intersection. It's not an intersection. I said intersection. It isn't an intersection. It's a driveway. It's just an ordinary driveway, but it feels like crossing a huge intersection without actual traffic controls. And so the bicyclist or the pedestrians go, how do I get across this? There's cars going in and out, and turn radii that make it happen all fast, and turn lanes. So we have a lot of work to do, and that's kind of where that manual piece comes in. What happens then when you walk down that road? Sure, put in the bike lanes, but what else do you need to do?
So I'm going to combine 2 of the questions we got on route directness and ask Michael. One is about that 600-foot threshold distance between crossings, where that comes from. And then are you on the route directness index? So I think that Michael and Brian might both have thoughts here, but the threshold for the most a person would go out of their way to reach an all ages safe route. So Michael, if you could touch on the 600-foot distance between crossings that you used.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that distance is kind of the average block length in a urban suburban context. So that's kind of a starting point. I will say that it is really context specific. In that analysis that I showed earlier, when we applied that citywide, and there are some portions of the city that are less densely developed, it makes, it pops intersections that are high stress, but there's really not a lot of stuff happening around there, and not a lot of demand, if you will. So it's a starting point, and it takes some on the ground knowledge and understanding of kind of the land use context, and some adjustment from there. But yeah, it's largely based on just the average block length in an urban suburban context.
And then Brian, on the RDI as that was developed, if you want to say anything about the threshold, distance threshold that was applied to think about how far out of the way people would go. Some similar, but maybe not identical answer.
Yeah, okay, so RDI, we used just a working RDI of 2. So if you were over an RDI of 2, that was probably going to be less of an interest to that pedestrian, let's say to make a trip.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me jump in. How far out of, like, how?
Oh,
I think the question was, how far is that? How many?
Got it. Okay, so in our multimodal permeability pilot, we cite that Broach study that says pedestrians will not go more than about 230 feet out of their way for a better crossing. Is that what you're referring to? And then bicyclists will go up to about 25% out of their way for a better crossing.
And then if that's considered sort of an all ages measure, and I'm thinking, Michael, your block length, yeah, an adult flipping at a block is different than a little kid flipping at a block.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess if you're going over 230 feet, the issue is that you may just make your own crossing. If at least according to that Broach study, I think you could continue to do studies, and if you're trying to get across a major freeway, people might go pretty far out of their way to find a pretty good bridge. But yeah, if it's on if your store is right across the street and you've got to go down to the next light, press the button, cross, and come back again, people aren't going to do that. They just go right across. In my own hometown here, they go right across to the grocery store from where they live. So
I think we have time for maybe one more question. I don't know if we can squeeze in two. One is to ask about the scale to use for these analyses. Do you go focus on a corridor? Do you go jurisdiction wide? I will throw in, and do you overlay your transit service? Because that crossing, if that bus only runs once an hour, is a lot more important when the bus is coming. And they're charging you $5 a minute after 6 o'clock at childcare. Like you're gonna cross. So scale for an analysis looking at BLTS or PLTS. You want to copy that one?
I'll just say that when we do either BLTS or PLTS, we typically do it at the total network scale, and we're working with local jurisdictions. So we want to look, and we're typically developing citywide networks. So we're going to look at the whole city, but it can be just done just as easily at the corridor level or even kind of sub area level.
Yeah, and there was a comment, I'm not sure if it made it into everybody or just to us, that if you don't do that network, if you don't think about the network, and Brian mentioned the importance of crossings, that if you have great LTS, low LTS, and then you have to cross, that you don't have a network yet. You don't have a network until you have addressed crossings as well as those linear connections. With that, I think we're pretty close to time here. There's a feedback form in the chat. Brian, if you're able to really quickly find the study or drop in the link to our RDI report, that'll give folks references on that one before we shut off the Zoom. And then there was a question that Brian addressed in the chat about speed limit reductions as a way to improve level of traffic stress. And if you look at the Complete Streets Directive to us that's new in statute, it has a line in there saying if you have bike facilities, but they're not separated and the speed limit is over 25, that you need to look again. And that's really tying it to LTS, that over 25, the death at impact starts going up, and then if you don't have some separation, that your crash exposure is there. So that context matters again. Check on everything else. Click on that feedback form. There we go. Success ratio or rating in infant revisions. If you mean we're taking baby steps to get there by infant revisions, Rick, yeah. I guess I'll take moderator privilege in closing. With the Complete Streets Directive to WSDOT, with local projects applying to us for funding for one thing in one place. Well, I've been describing it again and again, saying you're going to see a patch and a patch and a patch and a batch, and then someday there's a quill. So it's not quite a network analogy, but things will be disconnected until they're connected. This is a very incremental process, and I know that might be the infant steps reference there. With that, thank you all so much. Watch your emails for links, watch YouTube for the follow-up recordings of these sessions, and thanks for being here.